Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you very much all for coming here to the LSE, to this, I don't know how many we have had, but we have had quite a few events already of the Cañada Blanch Centre since in this term. Last week, we had the Commissioner for Cohesion and Reform, Elisa Ferreira, and today we have the pleasure of having Jimmy Burns-Marañon. I'm going to introduce him, but probably he doesn't need a lot of introduction over here. I am your host. I am the Professor Studios Chair and a Professor of Economic Geography, plus the Director of the Cañada Blanch Centre, Andrés Rodríguez Pose. And that person sitting over there is the manager of the centre, Pedro Sanchez, who has been taking care of all this organization. So thank you very much. I've been at the LSE for almost 30 years. And I must say that the news that this is a cave full of spies is completely news to me. I never encountered one. I suppose that if they are spies, they're never going to tell me. But nevertheless, yeah, apparently there are quite a few. And there were even more 40, 50 years ago, despite the fact that when I joined the LSE, it only had 2,500 students. So it was a much smaller place than the one we have now. So today, Jimmy Burns-Marañon is going to be talking about his latest book, A Faithful Spy. I suppose you call him a faithful spy because it's not one that crosses over many, many times. But I'm not going to say Walter Bell, who studied at the LSE, but I'm not going to talk about Walter Bell. You talk about him. I'm going to talk about Jimmy, who, for those of you who don't know him, he was born in Madrid, like myself, and was educated at Stonyhurst College, University College London, where he did a BA in Modern Iberian and Latin American Studies. And then he came to the LSE when it was a much smaller place to do an MA in Politics and Government. He's a former Financial Times journalist, where he worked as a foreign correspondent and senior reporters covering security and intelligence. So you've been versed in the matter before, and formed part of the newspaper's award-winning investigative unit. He has contributed to international media across print, television, radio, and digital platforms. And his books, published in English and translations, include his prize-winning The Land and Its Heroes, How Argentina Lost the Falklands War, A Literary Companion to Spain, and then the football books, which I think are, for me, possibly the most exciting. The Hand of God, a biography of Diego Maradona, Barca, A People's Passion, Cristiano and Leo. I'm still discussing who is best. Who is best of the two?
Yeah, Cristiano.
Yeah.
Well, we could have an endless discussion about this. And a Pope of Good Promise. But today, we're going to listen to the presentation of A Faithful Spy, the life and times of an MI6 and MI5 officer. Jimmy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Andres has taken me completely by surprise because I thought we were going to be in a sort of in a conversation, but I mean, it'll probably be a conversation anyway with all you here, and it's wonderful to see some familiar faces. So I would have to rearrange what I was going to say, but I think that just to give some sort of context, how long do you want me to talk?
We have until 7:30.
Okay,
So it depends on how much
okay.
discussion you want to have with the audience.
Well, I always love discussion, actually, as people know me. What I suggest, I will try and, if I don't sort of lose my voice or run out, I will try and finish nearer to 7 and give about half an hour for the discussion, if that's okay. But and you know, I won't overrun. I think just to give, before I get into the book, just to give some context to it. And Andres, very sweetly, and thank you so much for having me here. And Víctor, I know you've been working behind the scenes, organizing everything, and also to my team in the BritishSpanish Society, Cristina and Maria, who've been brilliant as always. just to sort of frame a bit about, you know, my sort of involvement in this project, and also, you know, given where we are at the LSE connection, which is quite curious, as you will, you know, you will discover. As Andres pointed out, I was the foreign correspondent for the FT bracket after LSE, and then I started covering intelligence and security. As you probably, some of you know only too well, being a foreign correspondent in certain places immediately puts you, if not in the firing line, certainly under suspicion, particularly in countries that are run by totalitarian regimes. I happened to land in Buenos Aires at the end of '81, when there was, as I'm sure most of you will recall, there was the most appalling military regime there, the regime of the juntas, as we call them, who were already responsible for the deaths of from 15,000 to 30,000 disappeared, which I had protested against as a postgrad student very actively. So, you know, my number was to some extent sort of slightly marked. But the reason I was sent to, as quite a sort of young guy, to Buenos Aires was a very FT story, which is that my editor at the time, who had no interest at all in international affairs, but was very interested in the city and industry, was taken out to lunch by the chief executive of British American Tobacco, and who said halfway through the lunch, said, I think, you know, the FT is underreporting Argentina. It's a very interesting commodity market story there. It's not just meat, it's grains, and it really should be, you know, at the center of the FT's second section companies reporting, you know. And poor old Jeff Owen, who is a wonderful editor, actually immediately got back to HQ and went to the foreign desk and said, have we got anyone in Buenos Aires? And it was like something out of Evelyn Waugh's Scoop, but a rather kind of sheepish deputy editor for Foreign News said, well, actually, we have got someone. We've slightly lost touch with him over the last 5 or 10 years. I think he's got a rather bad drink problem and finds it very difficult to file any stories. Anyway, that was what Jeff wanted to hear, because at that point, I was not an alcoholic, and I'm not today. But, you know, I was young, youthful, energetic, dying to get away from London and looking for adventure. And so I was thrown into this environment, and within a very short time, developing sources, I realized that something was cooking, and something very serious was cooking, which is the planned invasion of the Falkland Islands. And I began to realize this quite a long time before it was even kind of reported widely, and indeed the British ambassador at the time, who'd gone completely native, refused to make a fuss about it. And but obviously British intelligence was beginning to get quite worried. Anyway, we were caught with our pants down, as you know, on the sort of 2nd of April 1982, the Argentine armed forces invaded the Falklands and occupied it under military occupation. And what followed was a full-scale war, which for the British under Thatcher became like a kind of reprise of the Second World War, probably the last time, and not probably, the last time that the entire Royal Navy fleet set off across the Atlantic 12,000 miles away, the most extraordinary mini war, which was won in the end. The reason I'm mentioning that is that halfway through that, my dear wife, who has always been an extraordinary ally, had been working as an English teacher. Her school had closed down, and she'd had to go across to Montevideo to get away from the whole thing. By May, which was the middle of the war, I was pretty stressed out, and she was getting stressed out not being with me. So she sort of came back, and I said, in a moment of sort of total lunacy, I said, look, why don't we just take the weekend off and go to the Iguazu Falls, which we both wanted to always go and see on the domestic airline. Anyway, it just so happened that at that time I had purchased a little Minox camera, of those little tiny little Minox cameras, which used to be standard issue during World War II and became even more of a standard issue for taking secret documents during the Cold War. I also had a map of the Brazilian-Argentine border, which had a whole lot of crosses marked on it. I mention this because as we were trying to go through passport control and customs, we were arrested. And I was accused of espionage. Under interrogation, we were separated, my wife was interrogated, I was interrogated. And the reason I said, you know, on what basis are you accusing me of espionage? And they produced my Minox, and they produced my sort of map, you see. And said, do you see those crosses? That's the special services, the SAS are going to come across the border of Brazil and come into a secret operation into northern Argentina. And I said, not really. The reason those crosses are there is because I was educated by the Jesuits, and a friend of mine told me where the Jesuit missions were. That just gives you an idea of this complete lunatic world one gets thrown into. Anyway, cut that story short. We were both released through an intervention of various people, and I went on covering the war. Then just to fast forward, because this is relevant in terms of my engagement as security and intelligence correspondent for the FT. When you're appointed to a role like that, you are vetted, basically. Vetted means that you've got a certain access to the security services and intelligence services on the basis of mutual trust, Official Secrets Act, certain things that you can cover, other things you can't, but you have access to information that Joe Public doesn't have, and then you are guided as to what can be published or not in particular emergencies. And I began my beat in Northern Ireland with the IRA campaign, the bombs on mainland Britain, including London. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and the whole world changed, really. And I started covering Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism, went to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and got quite involved in all that. Now, the other day I was giving a talk to another group of students, and one of them asked me, you know, what are the qualities or what are the specific job specs for joining the intelligence service, joining MI6? And the first thing, and I repeat today, complete disclaimer, I do not work for MI6. I've never worked for MI6. I'm not employed by MI6. And I've never spied. I've just been a journalist, all my life. But what I can tell you, as I told that person, is because I've got to know a lot of these people over the years. Is that if, and I say this to any students here, or if you know any students interested in this, that they have quite a good selection process. It begins slightly off-putting, like so much these days, with a sort of a kind of human resource computer thing that it all goes into, a questionnaire on a computer, and the computer analyzes your questions, and then the human resource people feed back to head office saying, you know, we're going to sieve this lot out. This lot quite interesting. Let's go for an interview. And then the question is, you know, what are the qualities they're looking for in the first face-to-face interview? And it's interesting because they're looking for people who are curious, people who, whatever education they've had, and they might have gone to privileged public school education, they could have gone to Eton, they could have gone to Stonyhurst, they could have gone Ampleforth, whatever, they could have gone to state school, you know. They have to sort of have done something outside the box of their formal education. So they might have they're also looking for sort of pretty good degrees. Intellectual excellence is pretty important. But outside the formal kind of box of education, they're looking for young people who have traveled, who have shown a genuine interest by what they've done, either working with refugees or traveling or living in another country, of empathy with other cultures, getting to know other cultures and getting to know why other cultures think differently about certain issues, which all this will become relevant when I get on to Water Bell. And the other thing which surprised me is humility. And I said, yeah, humility, why humility? He said, well, we're also looking for people who are not righteous, don't feel they're right, but believe in right, and have integrity and play to truth, and have a certain ethical conduct, who also do not bend to power, therefore be like the FT motto, beyond fear or favor. So whether before a president, head of a bank, whoever the person is, they are not going to be overawed and play to that person's power. They're going to be critical, inquisitive, questioning. Which brings me to Water Bell. The reason I got involved with water originally, I mean, 40 years separated us. Water was a friend of my late father. I'm delighted to see that there's someone here whose father also worked with my father. My father was in British intelligence in World War II in the Spanish embassy. Sorry, in the British embassy in Madrid. And obviously, once in it, you're never really out of it, but you keep all your friends through the years. And when I came back from Argentina in '86, my father said, look, there's a friend of mine who'd like to take you for lunch at the Travellers, his club. And Travellers were well known for a club of spies, among others. It didn't take us a rocket scientist to figure out he had something to do that. Anyway, I met this guy in downstairs bar already on his sort of third dry martini, and we knocked off a sort of bottle of claret, and we basically hit it off. He was very interested in what I had to say about Argentina, what I'd learned there, what I'd learned behind the scenes, and as my career progressed, we would meet now and again, and he would never tell me anything in detail about what he'd really done in his life, other than he'd been in the Foreign Service. And we got on very well, and I met his wife, his American wife, Tati, who I will mention again briefly in a moment. Tati Spatz. So fast forward from that meeting, in 2004, Water Bell dies at a ripe age of 94, I think it was. And I remember there was an obituary, a whole page obituary that appeared in the Times, and it was a classic Times obituary, which you read. I mean, Jeff Cowling over there, sort of in the diplomatic service, know exactly what I mean. It says far more by what it's not written than what is actually published, in the sense that there was a lot about him being in the Foreign Service and having worked in Washington during and New York during World War II, and then in London, and then being posted in other overseas assignments. And it mentioned Kenya, India, the Caribbean. And then it also mentioned a rather important thing was that he'd been given one of the top Whitehall decorations, which is the CMG, Call Me God, as they call it in Whitehall. And he'd also been given the US Medal for Freedom, 1947, after the war, which is given to very few non-Americans. So that gave you a hint of what that he'd obviously had a rather more interesting life than was actually shared in the obituary. But the next thing that happened is that I got a phone call from his widow, Tatty, who said, "Can you come around to Onslow Square," which is where they had a flat, "because I want to share something with you." So I sort of turned up, and I was met by Tatty, and behind her I could see in the sitting room, which I knew very well from previous visits, absolutely covered in boxes filled with papers. And she said, "These are Walter's papers, covering his entire life. And it was his desire, and it's my wish that you have them, because it's up to you what you do with them. But we both felt that if anyone is going to know the real story of Walter Bell, it should be you." So I went off with these boxes, and that was 2004. I didn't actually really get, true honesty, I didn't really get down to it till COVID. Why? Because as I mentioned, I was writing about 5 or 6 other books, including Cristiano and Leo, Maradona, Pope Francis, various other people, playing to my various interests. I was also trying to run a family, and also run the, being chairman of the British Spanish Society and previously vice chairman. So when COVID came, my dear wife said, "If you don't do something with those boxes, I'm going to shred them because they're taking up half the house. And it's come to a point when you've got to do something about it." So I spent sort of several days going through them, and I basically, it was like, as they say in the trade, pure treasure. I mean, what I was engaging with were hundreds of private papers, correspondence, notes, private memoirs he kept, which he hadn't handed into head office. And it took me several months to order them in a kind of, future narrative in terms of the various episodes of his life, because they're all over the place. It was like an academic's nightmare. It was certainly a journalistic nightmare to make sense of it. And gradually it was like putting together a jigsaw, and it all was coming together. And I thought, my God, this is an extraordinary book, potential book. So I started looking at it, and what I realized was that, and my journalistic instinct kicked in here, and also certainly my academic background as well. I wasn't simply going to write the book based on what he was saying. I had to double check a lot of what he was saying, because of the world he was moving in. I mean, spies are trained to be capricious and maybe not tell the truth sometimes. But I had no reason really to doubt certainly not the authenticity of the papers, but secondly, the honesty of a narrative which was current thoughts. I mean, these were letters written at the time, notes taken at the time, so very little of it was with the evidence of hindsight, which was important. So what emerged from that treasure what emerged was the most extraordinary, colourful life to a certain extent. This chap, Walter, was the third of 3 siblings, born, believe it or not, into a small Kent village where his father was the local Anglican vicar. His ancestry, however, was quite interesting because his grandfather, Aloysius, was the founder of the News of the World in the 19th century. News of the World at that time was not what it became under Murdoch, the News of the Screws. I mean, it was all the News of the Screws, I think they called it, wasn't it? But it was a sort of serious Sunday paper that reached out for the emerging, rising working classes. It wasn't particularly salacious at the time, and it was quite a serious newspaper. And it was eventually sold off to someone else, and it ended up in Murdoch's hands, and he turned into a sort of sleaze paper. But Walter's father decided he wasn't going to go down the journalistic track, and he had a vocation. He worked for the poor in the east of London, and he decided to become a vicar. So Walter is born in 1909, and here, historians among you, you really have to sort of put yourself, what's happening there? It's the end of the Victorian era, it's Edwardian era. There's this sort of rather kind of golden idea of the Edwardian era being this sort of wonderful, bright young things, and people are having wonderful parties, and it's all being turned into a sort of wonderful theatre. In fact, it was a moment of great social tension, and the sort of union rights beginning to kick in, the Labour Party beginning to be a serious party, all sorts of things going on here. But he also belonged to a generation too young to have fought in the First World War, and therefore utterly traumatized by what he heard about it, and feeling a bit guilty, actually, that he hadn't been part of the generation that gone over the trenches and led their men. But so by the time he gets sent to a private school to Tunbridge, after the Great War, the First World War, he is living all that. But he happens to be sent to a private school with a reputation for bullying and sort of ghastliness, like most private schools, boarding schools were at that time. In fact, a previous well-known pupil was Ian Forster, the novelist, who'd been there several years before. But Forster wrote that if you wanted to understand the Philistinism and the snobbery of British imperialism, you just had to look at the people educated in schools like Tunbridge, which was, of course, Forster talking at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. So Walter then comes out of Tunbridge, having done what then was called the Oxford and Cambridge Certification Board, which meant that if you did that exam and you came out with semi-flying colours with a good reference of your headmaster, you would probably go through Cambridge. In fact, poor old Walter found himself as the third son, drawing the short straw at a time when his family was getting into financial straits, so they couldn't afford to send him to Oxbridge. This is when he came out of school. So he spent the next 6 years taking on teaching jobs. And remember what I was telling you about before about the job spec. And not only sort of teaching in small schools and earning a living that way, but in order to travel. And he, so by the early 1930s, this young chap was on his own volition, was heading towards Northern Europe at a time of huge convulsion, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, obviously, also in Austria. there was, he was witnessing all this at first hand and being absolutely horrified by it. It politicized him in an ideological way. He became a sort of socialist. He campaigned for the Labour Party in the run-up to the 1929 general election for Ramsay MacDonald. Befriended several left-wing MPs like Oliver Letwin, and then he decides that while he's teaching that he's going to study for the bar, and so he starts studying law, and he studies. He goes to the Inner Temple, and he becomes almost a qualified barrister. At which point he looks across the road and sees the LSE and says, "I want to go. I want to go to university, and I'm going to go to. I'd like to go to LSE." And of course, his father, the vicar, was absolutely horrified because this was the godless university. This was the modern university founded at the end of the 19th century by the Socialist Fabian Society, were members of. Didn't believe in religion, full of Marxists, semi-Marxists at the time, but he was intent on doing this. At the same time, and this is the curious complexity of the man, he was developing. He was an absolute consummate social networker, developing ties with people in positions of influence, both in the judiciary and in politics, and indeed people close to the intelligence services. So difficult to believe this, but I only just got hold of his personal file, which was very kindly dug up for me from some archive in Dorset by the curator of the LSE library. I only got it about a week ago, and I got his personal file. And what it shows is that he basically, having taken that Oxford and Cambridge certificate, he applies to come into the LSE to study economics. And the reply he gets from, this bureaucracy will be familiar to you, and there's some bureaucracies in universities haven't changed, but the answer that comes back is that the certificate is no good for the LSE because it shows that you studied scripture, and that that we don't recognise this as a good as something that you should be studying. So you would have to retake the London certificate, and of course this would involve more weeks, more expenses, more that. He said, "Look, I want to be an undergraduate and start. I want to start the autumn term of 1934 studying economics." And then you get an extraordinary letter from a well-known international jurist who was at the Inner Temple, one of his contacts, who was Ficiri. Ficiri, if you look him up, was one of the most eminent jurists around, who writes on behalf of Water and says, "This is ridiculous. This is purely administrative. You've got to let this talented young man proceed with his degree." So he begins his degree and goes to several lectures, and at the same time gets a tap on his shoulder. And this is all true, difficult to believe. Around November 34, and he gets called to Queen Anne's Gate near Parliament Square, which is then the secret headquarters of MI6. And he gets interviewed, and he gets offered a job, which is in New York as assistant passport officer. Now, that might seem unbelievably drab, but the passport office was the cover name for MI6 offices around the world. They obviously weren't called MI6 or even the Foreign Office. They were just called passport offices. So you have this chap, aged 26, not yet 26, writing to the LSE. I said, "Terribly sorry, but I'm going to have to leave my course because I've been offered a job in the passport office in New York." where they need it needs some legal advice. I mean, it seems unbelievable that this is how it was, you know. And there, so water arrives in America. I mean, can you imagine this young guy crossing the Atlantic, crosses the Atlantic as you did in those days in this ocean liner. It's a wonderful time getting there. And he arrives in New York, and his job really between his arrival and the start of World War II is to try and be one of the people as an influencer to try and get the Americans eventually to join the British, and come into the war. Now, I mean, given what we're now living with a certain Mr. Trump and things, there was a Gallup poll conducted in the United States in circa 1938. This is when Czechoslovakia was being invaded, when Poland was about to be invaded, when the Brits were, you know, Churchill was warning, you know, Hitler's at our door across the pond. A Gallup poll conducted nationwide in the States showed that 13% of the Americans were prepared to go into World War II. The rest were totally anti-intervention, and they were pro-America first, i.e. we had a disastrous decision to go into the First World War in the last few weeks. The First World War, where 22,000 of our boys died because the Brits asked us to come in, we're not going to do that. And that was what MI6 station in New York was up against. So the first part of his career was really as part of a unit that was working on this in a big way. And of course, it is now well-known history that it took Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, for Roosevelt to finally tell Churchill, right, we're declaring war, not just on Japan, but on Germany. At which point, an organization was set up in New York, where called British Security Coordination, which was set up by MI6, and it covered everything from propaganda to covert operations to liaison with the Americans, and Walter started working for that outfit. Fast forward, he was sent to Mexico, managed to stop an attack by the Germans to run the oil embargo out of Tampico in Mexico. And consequently, the American Navy blew it out of the water. So that was quite a success. And then by the time sort of Roosevelt had decided to go into the war, thanks to his efforts and others, the American public, media, you know, key stakeholders were pretty primed. People in Wall Street, people in the New York Times, people in Washington Post, they were all trying to support the Allied cause. Then Walter spends the rest of World War II liaising as the key man with the FBI and with the nascent CIA organization, which is the OSS, up to 1942, at which point the OSS start landing literally in London, dozens and dozens of their officers, because the whole intelligence operation with the occupation of France moves to London. And Walter is relocated to London and spends the rest of the war liaising with the Americans on covert operations and top secret operations. And then he, after the war in 1946, he gets appointed as private secretary to the then UK ambassador, Lord Inverchapel, who was quite an eccentric guy, not least, or at the time it was eccentric, thank God it's not eccentric anymore. He was bisexual, rather liked American boys rather more than his Chilean wife. And he had sort of, you know, Walter knew all about this, kept very, very, very loyal to his ambassador. But the most eccentric thing of it all was that previous to that posting, he'd been HMG's ambassador in Moscow and had got on quite well with Stalin, which led some people in the Houses of Commons to suggest that Inverchapel was a Soviet agent, which he wasn't. But Stalin, as a farewell present, believe it or not, gave Inverchapel a valet and a masseuse who happened to be a German Russian, who then arrived in Washington with Inverchapel. And Inverchapel and him got on very well, and he looked after the ambassador very well. But such was the pressure in the House of Commons and the Foreign Office and things that Inverchapel sort of very kindly suggested to his valet, probably be better if you leave. But, don't worry, I will guarantee you a job for life on my estate in Scotland. So, this semi-Russian heads to the Highlands and ends up marrying a Scottish girl and running a fish and chip shop for the rest of his life. So, that From Russia with Love ends up and that's a real cameo. You could have made a movie, another From Russia with Love movie out of that. So again, fast forwarding, Walter by the time he's finished in Washington, working in Washington, one of the people he was working with, or happened to be in the embassy when he arrived, was one Donald Maclean, who was at the time first secretary in the embassy, Foreign Office career diplomat on the rise, who, as some of you may know, was subsequently exposed as one of the Cambridge Five. So at that time, Walter didn't know about this, nor did his ambassador. In fact, no one else in the embassy knew about it. He was feeding the Soviets top-level intelligence on intercepted traffic from the ambassador, going back and forwards to London. But Walter actually, without knowing any of this at the time, got on quite well with Donald Maclean. But before Maclean then gets moved on to Cairo, and in fact misses Walter's wedding in Washington by 3 months. And Maclean at that time was married to an American. Walter had started going out with Tatty Spatz, who was the oldest daughter of General Spatz, one of the top World War II American generals, happened to be Eisenhower's favorite Air Force general, in charge of the whole Air Force campaign in World War II. And they marry in Georgetown in 1948. At which point, Walter is beginning to feel that MI6, there's some kind of glass ceiling, and he's not going to go right up to management. He doesn't want to go up to management. There are people on the selection committee that he doesn't particularly like. Irony of ironies, as with the evidence of hindsight, one of the people on the selection committee was one Kim Philby, who was obviously picking his own kind of people. And at that, coincidentally, or because he'd been recommended, Walter gets offered a job by the head of MI5 to come over to MI5. Now, forget about what MI5 is today. MI5 at that time was given priority status in intelligence gathering terms and in any other secret terms or covert terms over MI6 or any other government agency in the British colonies at the time and the Commonwealth. Which meant that if you were posted abroad by MI5, it was the equivalent of a kind of what an MI6 station posting would be today. So he finds himself posted to Kenya at the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s, in the run-up to Mau Mau, the Mau Mau insurgency, one of the bloodiest insurgencies suffered by the British Empire, with probably, in terms of bloodshed, only equaled by what happened in India at various times. And he's there in the run up to Mau Mau, but actually moves out before Mau Mau actually moves out. What's interesting about his reports back to London was that he was saying, look, I know what colonial authorities in London are building up to. They're going to building up to this huge repression of this insurgency, concentration camps, executions, just playing the toughener. This is a nascent African nationalist movement. We've got to understand what motivates them. What motivates them is decades of intolerance, abuse, racism, injustice. And unless we address that, we're going to be landing with a much bigger problem later on, which is extraordinary kind of integrity, actually, of someone to take a different line when there was enormous pressure just to take a repressive attitude towards the whole thing. But on the back of his, MI5 rated him very highly for the way that he seemed to have the guts to share the intelligence he had in a way that he didn't bend simply to the diktats of his masters. And he was subsequently posted to India with the first independent government of Nehru, and there liaised with Nehru's intelligence services. And he went on to the Caribbean, where he did some similar things in the Caribbean at a time when the Caribbean was politically quite volatile. This was pre-Cuban Revolution, but things were getting quite tough in places like Guyana, which is the subject of a subsequent CIA-backed coup against the socialist prime minister there. Now, I'm reaching the end of my part on this. To get to the latter stages of Walter's career, a very extraordinary thing happened to Walter at the beginning of the 1960s when he was basically Macmillan, who was then the Prime Minister, decides his famous Wind of Change speech that British foreign policy towards the colonies has to change, and it's going to become much more engaging with nascent independent movements. We mustn't be excluded from the process. We've got to accompany the process, manage it, make sure that it's still in the interests of Britain and its empire, and therefore one of the areas, given the Cold War, that we can help is by countering the increasing Soviet influence in places like Africa and India. So Walter, extraordinarily enough, somewhere in Whitehall, people sort of clock the memory of his first time in Kenya. Say, yeah, this guy is someone who understood something about the nascent African nationalism at the time. And what's more, the guy who's just about to be the first independent president of Kenya, one Jomo Kenyatta, has asked that Walter Bell come back to Kenya to be the main liaison officer on security matters with the first independent government, with the approval of the Director General of MI5. So Walter and Tati find themselves back in Kenya, and they're there until 1967, advising Kenyatta on potential Soviet-backed communist coups and various things like that, and the infiltration of Nairobi University by the KGB and lots of Cold War stuff, you know. Now, in his, you know, it's almost like a kind of García Márquez sort of, you know, magic realism undercurrent of history. It's so coincidental. I mean, as Ortega y Gasset used to say, we are what we are in our circumstances. Is it all circumstantial? Is there some sort of mysterious narrative that puts us all down the same current, you know? Kenyatta himself studied in this place, in the LSE. and he happened to be in the LSE in 1934. And at that time, one Walter Bell was here. I can say, hand on heart, I found nothing in the papers suggesting that Walter and Cañada met while they were here. What I can tell you is that it's perfectly plausible that they met in the corridors or they met sharing some lecture. The fact is that Cañada at that time had just arrived from Moscow, where he'd been studying in Moscow University, and was in a irony of ironies, an MI5 file saying that he was a suspect Soviet agent, which is not true. But there you have fast forward, and you have MI5 having put him under surveillance from the special branch when he was at LSE, ends up with Walter Bell liaising with Joe Cañada on behalf of MI5, so they can all work together. Quite extraordinary. So he retires, and there I go into really what leads to the title of the book, because if you know everything, I'm sure some of you know about Cambridge 5, which has been written about so much, and you've read John le Carré, and forget about Bond, because Bond bears no resemblance at all to any real life spy, although he was a great recruitment agent when Dr. No came out. MI6, you had all these public school boys thinking they were going to have a line of women going to jump into bed with them. But you know, that is a great recruitment agent at the time, but it was not real. Walter, when he was in Kenya the first time, was hugely impressed by the humility and sacrifice and service for others in the slums of Nairobi among the native Africans, Kenyans, of the Irish Catholic missionaries. As a result of which, he converted to Roman Catholicism. And this was a process that had been building up during the 1930s, because he'd started reading Jacques Maritain and Christopher Dawson, the great exponents of Catholic social teaching, as a third way between Marxism on one side and fascism on the other. He'd been quite impressed by that. And then, you know, the subconscious came up again in Kenya. He converted, and his faith in a God of some kind, very different to that which in the vicarage of his father, who he regarded as a rather sort of pious totalitarian, who insisted on taking his first confession and saying, you know, all sorts of doing sort of weird things while he was as a young boy. He deepened in his faith, his Catholic faith. Given that spies are quite complex characters, I sort of developed the leitmotif of Walter Bell. Why was it that he didn't follow the people he'd worked with? Because he knew Philby as well. He'd worked with Philby, the other key Cambridge 5. He knew Burgess, and he'd been a socialist at LSE. Why didn't he go to the Soviets? You know, why didn't he go to Moscow? Basically, the answer lies in basically two things. His wife Tati, with whom he remained happily married on a very, very long marriage. They didn't have children, but she was an ally, a supporter, a wonderful lady. They were like this, and all the postings come through very clearly in his papers. And the other one was this sort of faithful, at least search with doubt for a God and for a meaning to his life. And I mentioned that one of the psychological states that are developed by many spies is a thing called camel's back syndrome, the camel's back syndrome, which is basically a neurosis that you develop, a manic depressive neurosis that you develop which can be summed up as the weight of so much of what you know and the weight of so much that you can't speak about becomes so intense that it almost, the burden of it breaks you psychologically. Now, spies deal with it in different ways. Some of them have nervous breakdowns. A lot of them had nervous breakdowns after the Second World War. A lot of them, I know, had nervous breakdowns as a result of Al-Qaeda. But Walter managed it, and I think he managed it through his love for his wife, the support of his wife, and also his faith. And so I basically conclude the book by basically saying that he was, like so many in secret intelligence, Bell was a complex, ambiguous character and could be elusive with motives that were not always quite what they seemed. He was no knight in shining armor and was prone to human and professional failings, as I've tried to identify in these pages. But he had integrity, a man of faith with a strong moral sense of justice and a belief in democracy. He still found space for nuance and irony, for a lightness that contrasted with the heaviness of ideology that turned some of his generation towards extremes of intolerance and even betrayal. Not that betrayal would ever have been an option for Walter Bell, loyal to his church, friends, family, colleagues, king and country. He was a truly faithful spy. That's it.
We've set the ceiling for quite a lot of discussion. So who wants to start asking questions? Just please say your name and where you're from.
Mariella Hargreaves. Thanks for that, Jimmy. I just wondered, did you have to clear any of your material with MI5 or MI6?
Thanks for that question. The simple answer is that there were people who wanted me to clear it, and I thought I'd take them on. Well, not take them on. I thought I'd bluff it in the sense that if you want to clamp down on me, go for it. My publisher is sitting over there. There was part of us that said, "Come on, for Christ's sake, arrest me. This will boost our sales." You know? But I mean, I'm not being some cavalier about this or macho about this. Because I'd covered intelligence, okay, and been vetted and all that. When I went through the papers, I had at the back of my mind the whole time, Official Secrets Act, Official Secrets Act, Official Secrets Act, because, whenever I wrote something for the paper, this was, you mustn't get a D notice, I mustn't get a call from Whitehall saying, we're going to impound the paper, or, you're going to be arrested tomorrow and find yourself in the High Court, And I was very conscious of this reading the paper, because the one thing that, for those of you who ever wish to enter this area, that one thing that is a no-no is naming agents, okay, because the way MI6 and indeed the CIA operate, but MI6, you have a field officer who's not the support staff, he's a field officer, and he develops through human contacts, sources, a field of agents, who feed him information. And SIS or MI6 position is that the reason the Official Secret Act exists, and also why MI6 files are never released, unlike MI5 files, to the public. And in fact, papers are restricted, is that it would undermine the whole organization, because no agent would ever trust us again. If agents in the past were named with still while they were alive, or if they had children who inherited their name, or wives who outlived them. That's the reason, okay? So with 2 or 3 exceptions where you can read between the lines, I didn't see him naming agents. I saw him naming agents of influence, which is slightly different. I did show it to someone very high up in MI6, extra officially, because I wanted him to read the book, and both Stuart and I, my publisher, and I wanted a really good comment from him about the book. And also, I managed him to chair one of the first gigs we did on the book, which was in a private setting for members only, and he agreed to be in conversation with me. And he said there, and we quoted him, he said, "This is an extraordinary and very rare cachet payment." Sorry, where you have described a cog in the machine of 20th century intelligence during a very important time. So we got what we wanted. But I hope that answers your question. So no one has raided my house yet. But I intend to give, I hope they'll pay for it, but the papers to an eminent university.
Jimmy, there's a couple of guys out there with trench coats and trill beers and handguns. Just thought I'd let you know. There may be a back entrance out there.
I was going to say, you know what's happening in your house at the moment.
Yeah.
So, more questions? Well, if I can get this going.
Was there any mention of Graham Greene in the?
Can you just say your name and where you're from?
Catherine Davis. Any mention of Graham Greene in the newspaper?
There was no mention of Graham Greene, but again, thanks for asking that, because actually, Graham Greene was a great friend of my father's. In fact, my father, before World War II, subsequent to World War II, was a publisher, and he published Graham Greene's first book. As you know, Graham Greene went into MI6. I do mention Graham Greene in the book. Why do I mention him? Because he coincided with, although Water doesn't write about him, in Kenya. I mean, you might know this, but Graham was who I met actually. I'll never forget meeting him. And he gave me a wonderful endorsement in my first book, which was incredibly generous for a first book by a young author. But Graham was sent by the Sunday Times to do 3 feature articles on the build up to Mau Mau, which were brilliant. I've got them in my archive, and but what's interesting is that once a spy, always a spy. But Graham was apart from being a bloody good novelist, he was actually a very good journalist. He showed it when he went up to Vietnam, and so he was very good at developing sources. And he spent a lot of time talking to the Irish missionaries, because he knew that they were among the people. And it's like, my experience as a foreign correspondent going around Latin America during the military regimes, my first port of call were the Jesuits, because I was educated by the Jesuits. The Jesuits knew what was going on because they were with the people. They were also educating the people who were persecuting the people.
More questions? Let me just go, while we wait for questions, about the LSE 1934.
Yeah.
And so LSE 1934, I just wanted to check how big the LSE was. So I was looking frantically on my phone and found that I couldn't find the number of students, but they said that a canteen was open with had a capacity of 400, which could host almost the entire student body of the LSE at that time. You know, it's not a surprise for me. So we're talking about 500 maximum.
Yeah.
When I joined, I said it was 2,500, and that was in 1995. So in that respect, it's very, very likely that Jomo Kenyatta and Walter Bell met, not just in the corridors, but if you have a community of 500, you're going to. But I have a question for you, are you entirely certain that Walter Bell never passed secrets to the Soviets?
Yeah, I can tell you why. Because as you can probably imagine, when the Cambridge Five affair blew in the media, okay, well, long before that, the Americans were aware of what was going on. Some people at MI6 were aware of what's going on. Some people at MI5. There were lots of internal inquiries. Okay, problem was, as some of you know now, I mean, it was the old boy network. You know, how could it possibly be true that you know Philby is a Soviet spy? How can it be that Don McLean, this fast-track sort of foreign office guy, is an agent? You know, it's just can't be true. But so they basically got away with it. They all, you know, Philby got to Moscow, as you know, and Burgess and McLean, the two of them went off at the same time. At which point, they had a lot of bad blood really coming from across the pond from the Americans saying, "You Brits, you know, how could you have possibly employed someone like Burgess, who's an absolute alcoholic, and someone like Don McLean? Must have been, you know, why did you employ people like that?" And Philby, we suspected him, you know, long before you lot, but you didn't do anything about him. You just let him go because you didn't want to put him on trial, which is partly true. But the point, to address your point, is that there were big inquiries that went on internally in Whitehall, and everyone was pulled in who had been remotely involved with any of them. And I have no doubt at all that Walter Bell was very, very heavily interrogated. You might say, well, actually, it must have been a real double spy because he would have lied through his teeth and got away with it. But there's no evidence in the KGB papers that were briefly came to light in the early 1990s when we were all friendly before Putin turned up, and academics were going to Moscow and being shown KGB files by friendly Russian historians and things like that. Absolutely, what there is, which I quoted a KGB document where Philby is reporting on Walter Bell during World War II in a way that makes it absolutely clear that if Philby had thought he was going to recruit Walter, he decided that he was not a communist, that he wasn't a dogmatic Stalinist like Kim Philby was, like the Cambridge Five were, who were completely Stalinist ideologues. You know? And then the final point is that to this day, Walter Bell retains the two medals I mentioned right at the beginning, which are probably two of the highest awards on either side of the Atlantic that anyone in government service can get. One is the CMG on the British side, and the other one is the Medal of Freedom. You know, it would have been taken away from them if there'd been any suspicion of him being a double agent or whatever. But it's a question that obviously I asked myself at the beginning of this whole process: was he the sixth man? And you know, my conclusion was the one I reached. You know, in a way, probably Stuart would have preferred me to have written the sixth man, but I mean, the fact was that, hand on heart, the on the balance of probability, forensic analysis, and call it what you want, of a lot of time I spent researching this book and talking to a lot of people inside intelligence, outside intelligence. I mean, no, definitely not.
My experience of spies is mainly James Bond films,
Hmm.
of course, but if the Soviets were to have a cell in the UK, will they only have one cell, or would they have separate cells that don't talk to one another and know about one another?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I think you know more about spies than you give to think, but the fact is that the main kind of penetration of British intelligence, which began to be operated from Moscow in the mid-1930s, they targeted Oxford and Cambridge, okay, because you know they regarded as the university producing the elite, the establishment and things, and if they penetrated that and recruited students there, they would be in very high places of influence in the establishment. Although obviously, like in all other universities, there were people there of different ideologies, but LSE, as it always has been, well, it certainly was in my time, you know, it's always been ideologically left wing. You know, I mean, it's. I mean, I almost became a Marxist when I was studying, because my tutor was Marxist.
More questions?
I just thought,
You didn't say the name and
I'm Stuart Lee, so I'm the publisher for this, but I just thought a couple of things that I thought people might be quite interested is the great pub crawl, which I just thought is a little vignette, and also the bit about, you know, towards the end of his career with Dick White, you know, with the, you know, rehabilitation, or, you know, sort of, which I just thought two little things that might be quite interesting.
Yeah, well, Stuart, of course, knows the book better than I do. See, had to correct all its errors and edit it 5 million times. So anyway, that's what publishers, thank God, are good at. Okay, the two things that Stuart, I mean, mentions, I talk about in some anecdotal detail, based on information that was given to me by Tatty, by his widow. His Waters' dealings with 3 of the Cambridge 5. I mentioned Donald MacLean. The other one was Guy Burgess. The other one was Kim Philby. Guy Burgess, which some of you might know from films or having read other books and things. Guy Burgess, to this day, I can't imagine why he was ever recruited by any intelligence agency, but he was totally decadent in every sexual point of view. He at the time when you know certain activities were prohibited by law, so he was a raving homosexual at a time when you know you had to keep your head down if you were gay. Thank God all that has changed, but you know if you were in government service, right? But he managed to sort of get away with it. And the other thing was that he was a complete alcoholic, get drunk the whole time. And I tell the story that one day in the middle of World War II, when Walter was in London, liaising with the Americans, he'd obviously met Burgess. The circumstances I'm not quite sure why or when, but Burgess invited him to go on the so-called Karl Marx pub crawl. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Karl Marx pub crawl, because I've done part of it, but it is now quite popular among certain aficionados. You can look it up on the internet, but it begins more or less where Marx, in his time living in London, when he was writing Das Kapital, he was living in Soho, and then he eventually moved to North London, to Belsize Park, around the Hampstead area. He would walk along Tottenham Court Road, and drop in on several pubs along the way, some of which, four of which still exist to this day. Marx actually liked his tipple, and in fact, reportedly at one point, so I had a huge fight outside one of the pubs and was semi-arrested, but got away with it. Anyway, so Burgess begins with Bell, and by the time they got to the sort of second pub, he was getting so appallingly kind of obnoxious, alcoholic, drunk, that Bell just sort of said, "Look, that's enough for the evening. I'm quitting." So he didn't do the full pub crawl with him. The other thing, what was the other thing?
I'm just thinking about the Dick White, you know.
Oh yeah,
trying
the
to
Dick
figure
White.
out
Right,
after
okay, well,
20
Dick White
minutes.
plays to, and the rest to your question. A very, very key part of the papers I discovered was, because of the detail of the correspondence, was revealed a very, very enduring friendship that Walter Bell had with Dick White. Now, Dick White is probably, in terms of 20th century intelligence, British intelligence history, is probably the most highly regarded British intelligence officer, because he is unique in having been the head of MI5 at one point and the head of MI6, and in fact was moved from one to the other because of the Philby Cambridge affair, because he was the only person that trusted. He was almost like a kind of Smiley in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And you have this incredible correspondence, which is at the time of the Cambridge 5 affair, Dick White enlisting Walter's assistance, what can only be described as a kind of, in cynical terms, a damage limitation exercise, but actually an attempt to put right what they both saw, and a lot of their colleagues felt, a huge injustice by some tabloid newspapers picking up on some Soviet misinformation, suggesting that the penetration of British intelligence was much bigger than the Cambridge 5, and beginning to name some well-known senior figures of intelligence as Soviet moles, which is all complete invention. And it was a sort of classic, Putin's still trying to do the same thing now, but it's a classic kind of misinformation campaign, fake news, call it what you want, which was at that time being done. And so Dick White and Walter conducted a quite successful campaign to clear the name of two very senior intelligence officers by working on their sources in the Times, and managing to get the Times to publish a series of articles with a lot of detail about why these guys couldn't possibly be Russian agents. So that's what Stuart was referring to. But that correspondence is probably among a very, very interesting sequence of letters. Because it shows that Dick White certainly held Walter in high esteem, and Walter held Dick White obviously in high esteem. But I think if I'd remembered that, I would have also used that as in the case of the defence, as it were, for those who might have thought that Walter. But I mean, you know, don't forget that I lived with Walter I knew Walter from 1986 right through to his death, 2004. And what I lived with was a man who went to mass every morning at the oratory. This was in retirement, the London Oratory. Every morning he gave mass. And who, before he died, insisted on full rites of Catholic ceremony and things. You know, this was not kind of civilization.
Go ahead, please. Yeah, sorry, my name's Richard Farden. I wondered,
Was it generally approved for somebody to keep a personal archive on that scale when they were working for the intelligence services? I mean, are there any examples of people who've been in similar positions who also maintained large personal archives? And the other, just on something totally different, presumably he knew that Blunt was also a spy during the long period when Blunt wasn't outed. So I wondered how that sort of squared with his comments.
I never talked to him about Blunt and nothing about Blunt years, but obviously he would have been in the know. To address your first question, I mean, you know, the sort of when I wrote the sort of the initial manuscript of the book, as I said earlier, I showed it to a high-level source in British intelligence, and I also showed it to 2 or 3 academics on both sides of the Atlantic, very experts in intelligence history, but also in Whitehall and all that, including Professor Peter Hennessy, who probably is the sort of the godfather of us all, and Chris Andrews and people like that, and they all came back and said, "But you know, this is pretty unique. It is, you know, he should have probably handed them all in or destroyed it, but he didn't. And as whether, you know, I can't. I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I defy anyone to think of any. And I've read a lot of books on intelligence. There's not one single book. I've read lots of biographies of spies, books on to do with spies and all that. None of them, particularly biographies, show that people have had access to personal papers. All the authors had access to personal papers because the detail of it is unique for obvious reasons. But it does raise a follow-up question to yours, which, just to bring it up to date, and I talked about this a bit with talking to some students at King's College War Studies. They're all sort of intelligence geeks, you know more about the subject than anyone in this room, including myself, you know. But and we brought it up to date. But you know, it makes one think that. I mean, I sort of don't envy journalists, you know, authors, academics, students, researchers, because this kind of stuff just won't be around, you know, because you know you do not have people these days writing letters as they used to. You do not generally have people writing memos in longhand. You do not basically leave traces around in emails, or you know, you don't use WhatsApp if you're in intelligence services because it's not encrypted. I use something else, you know, all that sort of stuff. But it would be difficult to imagine someone in about 15 years' time, say, writing based on the papers of an MI6 officer who served at the turn of the 20th century into the 21st century. But what fills me always, the reason I was, you know, still a believer in journalism and believe in serious academic research is that where intelligence has not shifted is the importance of human intelligence. You can have all the cyber stuff you want, you can have all the geeks you want, trying to crack codes, you know, get around AI, doing all that stuff. But nothing equates to good human intelligence, which is working your sources, your friendships, gaining information, because that's the stuff that really endures. I'm seeing it, you might not see it as clearly as I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it in Gaza, I'm seeing it in Ukraine. You're seeing all sorts of things going on, but some of it is not being seen. But there's a lot of human input going on. And some of it is actually quite public. You've got the head of the CIA in Paris as we speak, in secret negotiations with the head of Mossad, with the Qatar government, which in a sense represents, a part of Hamas, because they've got the offices in Qatar, trying to broker a deal on Gaza. But you don't get that through intercepting each other's codes. You sit at tables like this, winning the trust of the person at that table. And the Putin thing is again rather extraordinary, because the Allies, well, the CIA definitely had people. They had sources that were telling them weeks before the invasion of Ukraine that that they were preparing to invade, and that is they would have had someone that they've got to be bloody careful, given the nature of the Putin regime. If he bumps off the hero last week, the way he's done, he's capable of doing anything.
I think we're almost done, but just one question regarding, you're talking about universities now and change, how spies have changed. British universities have changed radically. So from the time of Walter Bell, just as recently as 1980, only 8% of people in the age cohort went to universities. Now it's 45.
In what?
In 1980.
Yeah, but in what?
8% of the age cohort went to university.
Correct.
Now it's 45, but the university have become much bigger
Mhm.
and much more international. The university like the UK, like the LSE, which is probably the most international in the world, we barely have any British students. We have very few, mostly undergraduate.
Yeah.
Postgraduate is more than 90% foreigners. How active do you think are spy Ravens and spy, the MI5, MI6, or other spy agencies in British universities these days? And I know you're happy speculating.
Well, I mean, I could say I couldn't possibly comment, but well, I mean, this is a very controversial subject, but I mean, what I can, let me answer that by, as I said early on, I covered when I was security and intelligence defense correspondent of the FT. I found myself covering the Northern Ireland, but then the Al Qaeda, the Islamic fundamentalism. Okay, well, at that point, several universities, quite a few universities up and down the country, including this one, including SOAS, to name but a few in London, had MI5 agents actively infiltrated to keep tabs on suspect people who might be more than sympathetic towards Islamic fundamentalism. You can also take it as said that when it comes to the Chinese, there's probably quite of interest as well, and not to speak of Russians. But I would say those three areas are quite continuing interest.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jimmy. April's 5, 11. There you are. So you can get them there. And for those of you that are interested, you can follow us, the Cañada Blanch Centre, either on Twitter or on our website and LinkedIn. And we're going to have a series of new events. I mean, they come thick and fast. Next Monday, on the 4th of March, we have Louis Dijkstra from the European Commission on the Future of Cities. On the 5th, we have the Spanish ambassador, José Pascual Marco, talking about Spain, UK and Europe. And then finally, on the 25th of March, we have Salvador Illa, the former Minister of Health of Spain and now leader of the Catalan socialists, coming also to give a talk. So just keep posted, keep tuned, stay tuned, and looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.